So here's the story so far. Look at chapter 2, starting in verse 1. There's sort of like a 3-tier cycle that's kind of going around in Genesis. It goes disobedience, disassociation, deliverance. That just keeps happening over and over again. There's disobedience. That disobedience comes from the fact that there's a disassociation with the works of God, and then the mess that gets the people in requires them to be delivered. So look at verse 1 in chapter 2. The angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochum and said, I brought you out of Egypt and led you into the land I had promised to your fathers. I also said, I will never break my covenant with you. You are not to make a covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You are to tear down their altars. But you have not obeyed me. What is this you have done? Therefore, I now say, I will not drive out these people before you. They will be thorns in your sides, and their gods will be a trap for you. When the angel of the Lord had spoken these words to all the Israelites, the people wept loudly, I bet. So they named that place Bochum and offered sacrifices there to the Lord. So first off, we are in the middle of a cycle of disobedience. He's like, I asked you to do one thing, and you're doing the exact opposite. So here, you can have exactly what you want. And then they're like, please don't do that. So they're in this disobedience, which has come from a little bit of a disassociation with the works of God. Look at verse 10 in chapter 2. That whole generations was also gathered to their ancestors. After them, another generation rose up who did not know the Lord or the works he had done for Israel. So a lot of the disobedience comes from the fact that they just have no clue what's going on. It's not been communicated to them. They didn't experience God do amazing things. It's in some sense the next generation. I always think of where in the 70s there was the Jesus movement. I'm kind of the next generation after that. Didn't happen to me. I wasn't there. And so there's definitely people within my demographic who would fall under a category of disobedience because they're just kind of disconnected from an amazing move that God did. And he says, that's your problem, is that there's a future generation that just doesn't know what I've done for my people. So that's why they're being disobedient. And then it lands in verse 16 in chapter 2. The Lord raised up judges who saved them from the power of their marauders. So ultimately God says, well, I'll deliver you. When they cry out, they get delivered. That's usually the cycle. Disobedience coming from a disconnection or a disassociation with the works of God that winds up needing a deliverance, and that comes because they will cry out. You know, they get what they deserve, and then they're like, please save us. And he does. He raises up judges to get them out of it time after time. And then look down at verse 18. It just repeats over and over and over again. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge for the Israelites, the Lord was with him and saved the people from the power of their enemies while the judge was still alive. The Lord was moved to pity whenever they groaned because of those who were oppressing and afflicting them. Whenever the judge died, the Israelites would act even more corruptly than their fathers, following other gods to serve them and bow and worship to them. They did not turn from their evil practices or their obstinate ways. It's kind of like rinse and repeat. They disobey because they don't know how great God is. They cry out for deliverance. He does it. It goes well for a while. And then they disobey because they forget how great God is. And then they cry out for deliverance. And it goes well for a while. And I'm not going to keep doing it. But that's how that's 2 verse 18 through 19. He's like, and then we just kept singing the same old song over and over and over and over and over. But here's what God is going to do in our chapter to sort of subvert that bad cycle, because the cycle in and of itself is not redeeming. What he does with it has the potential to be redeeming. And so what God is committed to is his people's obedience. He's committed to getting them to see, you don't obey me, and I really want you to obey me. And he'll basically use any means necessary to pull out of their hearts the fact that they're not actually keeping their covenant that they made with him. So look at verse 20 in chapter 2, last pit stop before we jump into chapter 3. The Lord's anger burned against Israel, and he declared, because this nation has violated my covenant, that I made with their fathers and disobeyed me. I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations Joshua left when he died. I did this to test Israel and to see whether or not they would keep the Lord's way by walking in it as their fathers had. The Lord left these nations and did not drive them out immediately. He did not hand them over to Joshua. So the method of figuring out, are God's people going to obey him, is he allows opposition from without, and he calls that testing. He said, I'm going to leave those nations there. They shouldn't be there because it's the land that is promised them. And he said, since you keep disobeying, I'm just going to let them stay. And they're going to capture you and make you slaves. And he's basically saying, I'm doing that, 2 verse 22, to test Israel whether or not they would keep my commandments. Isn't that interesting? He says, the way I'll find out is when I start putting the pressure on from without. That's how I'll know if you're going to keep my covenant or not. So we see that proven in the first 6 verses of chapter 3. These are the nations the Lord left in order to test all those in Israel who had experienced none of the wars in Canaan. This was to teach the future generations of the Israelites how to fight in battle, especially those who had not fought before. These nations included the 5 rulers of the Philistines and all of the Canaanites and the Sidonians and the Hivites who lived in the Lebanese mountains from Mount Baal Hermon as far as the entrance to Hamath. The Lord left them to test Israel, to determine if they would keep the Lord's commands he had given their fathers through Moses. But they settled among the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. The Israelites took their daughters as wives for themselves, gave their own daughters to their sons, and worshiped their gods. So here's who's being tested, verse 1. Those in Israel who had experienced none of the wars in Canaan. That's the future generation. They have not seen the things that the older generation has seen. And so he's testing them. And you see that in verses 1, 2, and 4. You see testing and you see teaching. So he's doing 2 things by leaving the nations there and making the situation difficult. He's testing them to see if they're going to obey, and he's teaching them what's actually going on, and he's teaching them what it's going to look like to fight the battles. So the nations who were left, or as one verse in chapter 2 says, the thorns in their sides, whose gods will be a trap, are divinely kept in place to teach future generations how to fight in battle. Now this is important. It's not that he's left them there so he could teach them how to be like really dope soldiers. That's what it looks like he's like, I'll leave them here so you can learn how to be really good at like murdering people. That's not really the essence of the idea. Psalm 44 says, through you we drive back our foes. Through your name we trample our enemies. For I do not trust in my bow, and my sword does not bring me victory. But you give us victory over our foes. So how do God's people fight? They have to depend on the fact that he's going to miraculously win those battles for him. And he says, me leaving nations in front of you that seem, and all these obstacles that seem really impossible, you're going to learn what it's like to be my people and be in warfare. It's not about you being the stronger one. It's about you watching me deliver you from impossible circumstances. That's how you fight, is you wait, and then you see me act. And he has to teach the future generations what that looks like because they haven't seen it. And because they haven't seen it, they're like, I guess I should worship a different God. And isn't it gracious that he's going to teach them that lesson? And it's proven in chapter 1, verse 4, where it says, when Judah attacked, the Lord handed the Canaanites and Perizzites over to them. It says they struck down 10,000 men, but at that point it's irrelevant because right before it, God handed it to Judah. Judah had to do some stuff, but it's very clear that God's like, I did that. And he's trying to get them to see, you need to learn, future generation, that this is the way it works if you're going to be keeping a covenant with me. I win the battles. So the nations that are left are also there to, number 2, test Israel. It says in verse 4, to determine if they would keep the Lord's commands he had given their fathers through Moses. And if you know Joshua, in chapter 24, verses 14 through 24, the people of Israel make this grand claim. They're just like, we will do anything. We will serve you. We will worship you. We will not forsake you. And Joshua's like, you better put your money where your mouth is. Are you sure? Like, this is legit. And they're like, no. We're not turning away from him at all. And so God is testing that. He's like, you said it, so now it's actually going to be tested. He's going to bring an accountability to their declaration. You want to make some grand statement that you're all in? Let's find out. That's exactly what's going on. And you see this in Joshua 24, verse 26. Joshua recorded these things, this grand declaration they were going to worship Yahweh alone in the book of the law of God. He also took a large stone and set it up there under the oak at the sanctuary of the Lord. And Joshua said to all the people, you see this stone? It will be a witness against us, for it has heard all the words the Lord said to us, and it will be a witness against you, so that you will not deny your God. Then Joshua sent the people away, each to his own inheritance, which is where you find them in Judges. And each in their own inheritance, they one by one not keep the declaration that they made. And he's like, just so you know, there's a witness right here that if we don't do this, it will always be recorded that the rock heard it. It's actually super funny. It was just simply a way to say, let this be a symbol that today we declared we would worship nobody but God. Now go take your land. And they're like, okay, let's go settle with everybody else and worship other gods. He's like, that was fast. So verse 5 in chapter 3 in Judges tells us they're not really getting the lesson, and they're failing the test by doing something it calls settling among the other nations in verse 6. You see that they settle in location, and then they settle by creating a union within their families, and then they settle by ultimately worshiping the gods of the people that they yoke themselves with. And compromise always affects the family, because ultimately, whomever is the head of the household is settling where they are in their inheritance. And then instead of holding that line and casting that vision for obeying God, it says they gave their daughters over to marry the people from the pagan nations, which was like numero uno, bad move. And when you begin in your own life, dads, men, anybody here with a family, with compromise, that will leak into the other people that you're yoked to. Those kids may not have known the difference. They were given in marriage. So you have to be careful that when we are living amongst other people, different parts of culture, that you don't lose the line on what you've declared is going to be your oath and your vow to the Lord. Because if you do, it's going to affect more than just you. A whole generation winds up becoming corrupted because someone started handing their daughter over for a wedding. It probably didn't seem like a big deal at the time. So here's the key. Israel's commitment to their declaration they made, which was, we will certainly not abandon the Lord to worship other gods, Joshua 24:16. That's heavy. They're like, we won't. Nothing's going to stop it. Not going to happen. We're not going to abandon the Lord to worship other gods. That declaration was going to have to be tested in order to be proven. You can say whatever you want. But ultimately, God is saying, I'm doing this to test you to see if you meant what you said. And when it became tested, they absolutely fell apart. Sound familiar? I'll raise my hand. And future generations, they were going to have to learn that if you're going to make a declaration and a commitment to Yahweh, it has to be rooted in knowing how he works. That's why he's teaching the future generation who missed out on the wars of Canaan. They didn't see God hand thousands of people over to a small tribe of Israel. And so if they were going to say, we will pick up the mantle and declare to worship God alone, he's like, well, I'm going to have to teach you how this works. And funny enough, he says, the way we're going to do that is I'm going to leave a lot of opposition in front of you. And you're going to figure out what it looks like for me to work. And then you can make that declaration with more of a experiential knowledge. And here's what we see throughout Judges. It's being set up in this first few verses. This whole book is a process that's meant to reveal to Israel the truth about Israel. You know, it's not that God is learning something he doesn't already know. He's not like, well, let's test you to see how you do because I'm actually really not sure if you got it in you. He knows you're going to bomb. He wants them to see it. He's like, I'm testing you so that you can know just how far you've fallen. This test and this lesson from opposition from without is not so that I can figure out if this is going to happen. I know it's going to happen. It's so that you can see exactly where you're at. And it's so that they can learn where their character is, where their commitment is, where their actual stance with the Lord is. This is a time of testing to reveal more about them than to reveal something about them to God. And when we are tested, most of the time it's so that you know what's going on in you, because you don't, and neither do I. More times than not, my heart is deceitfully wicked. My conscience is telling me things that are probably not legitimate, and I'm justifying myself where I don't need to be justifying myself. And times of testing will ultimately show you, bro, you don't have it all together. And he's saying, we are going to show through this experience exactly where you are. And here's what they learn about themselves. Forgetfulness leads to settling, which leads to idolatry. That is the story of the people of Israel in Judges. They forget, so they settle, and then they worship other gods. It's proven in verse 7. The Israelites did what was evil in the Lord's sight. They forgot the Lord their God, and they worshiped the Baals and the Asherahs. The Lord's anger burned against Israel, and he sold them to King Cushan-Rishathaim. I sat there with that for a while today. Of Aram Naharaim. You like that? And the Israelites served him 8 years. Now, some of these, something like that, you might read right past it. I just want you to think about it. Their forgetfulness of who God was cost them 8 years of slavery. 8 years. That's like a lot. That's high school and college. Of like, now you're serving some other master. That's what you get. 8 years because of their forgetfulness, they have to serve this other king because it's their judgment. And the Israelites, verse 9, cried out to the Lord. The question is, did they cry out periodically right away? Did it take them the whole 8 years? I'd be like, day one, I'm sorry. Like, this is terrible. Please let it be a 48-hour lesson, like a 24-hour flu bug, and like, get me out of this. I can't do this anymore. Or like, are you just so stubborn that it takes you a whole dang 8 years to be like, all right, save me? But I think we can relate with the stubbornness. I know that, I'm making jokes, but my own personal story at different times in my life is I'll sit in my own stubbornness for a long time, thinking that it's not my fault. And that like God's gonna have to change it because like something else is going on. And he's like, well, we'll wait. 8 years. And then they cry out to him in verse 9. So here's where we start getting introduced to some judges. We're going to see 3 judges in this chapter, and you're going to see a whole lot more as we keep moving through the book. So he raised up Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, as a deliverer to save the Israelites. Now, it's important to note as we move through this book, the judges are not necessarily the point. Some people teach it and they try to have the judges be almost a parallel with us. You can do that. It's not that that's incorrect, but I think more than not, you'll find yourself as an Israelite, not a judge. I'm not delivering many people out of their issues. I'm usually needing a lot of saving. So that's where I find myself in the narrative. But the judges, even in and of themselves, are actually over and over and over again, incredibly unimpressive people. And it's by design. It's by design so that God can show it's not about someone amongst you becoming great. It's about the fact that I'll do it and I'll prove that I'm doing it because I'll raise up someone that could never do it. People look at characters like Samson and they elevate him as like this godlike figure. He was the worst. He was the worst. Sure, he had some great stuff. And at the end of his life, he really showed great colors in his character. But ultimately, it's a story of a guy that you just couldn't get his lust under control. And so God just keeps rushing on him with the Spirit to get things done. And then he's running over here to some woman. He's like, oh my gosh. Like, there's no judge really that comes in that you're like, now that guy nailed it. And the closest you get is Othniel and Ehud, which are our judges tonight, and the last one. They're the only three that you could try to make the case that like they were great. But even so, Othniel, we know through Jewish literature, was 91. So even though he might have been a great guy, he was elderly. And he's supposed to what? Destroy a nation? That's the whole point, is God's like, sure. That way, he's teaching that future generation, I do things unconventionally and in ways that can't give you the credit. So here's a 91-year-old man, he'll deliver you out of slavery. And it works. So, he says, the Spirit of the Lord came on him in verse 10. You'll see that a lot throughout the book. It's the first time it's in Judges right here in chapter 3, verse 10. And we'll talk about it more as we move through the book, I'm sure. But ultimately, the Spirit rushes on Othniel and he judged Israel. It basically means the Spirit empowered him, gave him what he needed to accomplish God's task. Things have changed now with the New Testament and what the Spirit does. So it's a little bit different than how we do it today. You know, the Spirit's not rushing on you to go tear up a nation, but that's what was necessary in this moment. And he's 91, so he's going to need a whole lot of Spirit. So the Spirit rushes on him. He judges Israel. Othniel went out to battle. Imagine 91 years old carting yourself out there to battle. I would be like, this is definitely God. And the Lord, here it is, handed over King Cushan Rishaim of Aram, thank you for shortening that this time, to him, so that Othniel overpowered him. I mean, if you are Israel, you're like, yep, that could not have happened any other way besides God empowering a 91-year-old man to overpower a king of a pagan nation. And that's exactly what you see. Then, verse 11, the land had peace for 40 years, and Othniel, son of Kenaz, died. So, you get to this rough verse in verse 12. The Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. You see that also up in verse 7. The Israelites did what was evil in the Lord's sight. They forgot their God and worshiped the Baals and the Asherah. That is what is evil. So the testing and the teaching is to show God's people you keep doing evil. He's bringing to light this cycle that we find ourselves in proves that you just keep doing what is evil, which is forgetting me and worshiping other gods. That becomes evil. Turn back to Deuteronomy chapter 6 if you don't mind. There's only a couple pit stops through the night. This is one of them. So go to the left to Deuteronomy. You're going to pass Joshua, and then you'll get there, chapter 6. So evil in God's sight is forgetfulness that leads to idolatry. He's like, they keep doing what's evil, which is they're forgetting about me and they're worshiping other gods. And some people might think, why is that a big deal? I think this is actually a very important pit stop to make because specifically, I think today when people read the Old Testament, they have a really big issue because you're like, why does God seem like such a megalomaniac and he's judging people and killing nations and doing all this stuff? It's a legitimate issue that a lot of people have where they're just like, I don't see how the God here and Jesus can be one and the same, which we'll get there by the end. So I think this is important to note and define what evil in his sight really is, what is justifying him judging them, sending different or leaving different nations to enslave them. In Deuteronomy 6, looking at verse 4, each morning and evening God's people would pray this to show that they were devoted to God. Listen, hear, Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. Every day, morning and night, still happens amongst the Jewish culture today. They will pray that, say it out loud, simply to just posture their bodies in a way where they're saying, it's only you, my whole heart, my whole soul, my whole strength, everything, it's just you. You're one, there's no one else. And then he says, but you do something else every single day. That first word, listen or hear, is Shema, and it means focus, pay attention, or respond to what you hear. So the idea is, listen, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Respond, love the Lord your God with all your heart. Respond, love the Lord your God with all your soul. Respond, love the Lord your God with all your strength. The idea is, I will listen and do what you say. That's the idea behind that word, listen or hear. Someone else is giving you a revelation, and you will listen to that and do what it says is the idea. And every day they're saying this and then going out and worshiping other gods. Older generations were supposed to teach this to their kids. Look at verse 6. These words that I'm giving you today are to be in your heart. Repeat them to your children. Talk about them when you sit in your house and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. It was the responsibility of the older generation to communicate, there is no other God but Yahweh. And every day we're going to declare that he has our whole heart, our whole mind, all of our strength, and then we're going to go do that every day. And it says when you're sitting around in the house, talk about it. When you find a moment that you can bring it up, teach it to your kids. But that's what's missing in Judges. That translation of God's goodness, that experiential knowledge that's going to become a narrative in the next generation's life, is not being passed down. And so they find themselves in this cycle of rebellious sin. And it convicts me because I have one child, and I think to myself, when he's older and he's off on his own, what will be the lessons and the things that he thinks about that my wife and I spoke to him or taught him? It could be a lot of stuff, a lot of good things. But if there's ever a time where he's alone or he's by himself or he finds himself in a difficult situation, will he hear in his mind and think like, God is here, he's one, I'm going to give him my whole heart, my whole soul, all my mind, all my strength. That's my responsibility to instill that in him. And that stopped happening, and so then it just becomes forgetfulness, settling, idolatry, deliverance, over and over and over and over and over. Now that word has another passage that's good with it. Exodus 19:5, I'll read it to you. God speaking to Israel now, if you will carefully listen, the idea is if you will Shema, Shema, which means like, I really mean it, if you will just respond to what I'm saying and keep my covenant, you will be my own possession out of all the peoples, although the whole earth is mine. So the simplest way to put it is, in the Bible, listening equals keeping your covenant. There is no separate word in the Hebrew for obey and listen. It's not that you listen and then you decide. It's that if you don't obey, you weren't listening, period. And sometimes we think, well, I'll listen and sort of like gain an idea of what I want and then I'll make a decision. Delayed obedience just means you weren't listening in the first place, according to the biblical narrative. And he says, if, in Exodus 19, you will respond every time I talk by keeping your covenant, he says, I will make you mine out of everyone else. And what they're doing all throughout Judges is the exact opposite. Listening and doing are two sides of the same coin. So in God's sight, hearing what he says and not responding in obedience is evil. That's connecting it back to Judges. So what is the evil in his sight that they're doing that is able to be put under such fire? It's exactly that. They've heard what I've said and they won't do it. That's evil. We try to define evil a lot of different ways, and most of it is just symptomatic of that. People not listening to God. So their consequence for that is pretty much getting what they're giving in verse 8. They're delivered over, but that's simply the Lord saying, well, I guess that's what you want. You're worshiping their gods. You can have them. We get so tripped by seeing judgment in the Bible. If you really think about it and study it, it's simply God saying, I will just officially give you what you're proving to me that you want. We're like, how could God do this and send people there and do that thing? As if we're all just like, I don't want to do it, please. No, I'm sorry. That's not how it works. He's like, you're worshiping their gods every day. Go live there. And then we're like, why would he do that? He's like, I thought that's what you wanted. Until you get there. And their only way out, verse 10, is to be delivered. And then their commitment becomes renewed in the sight of God, seeing God do a good work. In verse 11, the land had peace for 40 years because they watched God use the 91-year-old man to deliver them out of their mess that they made. And that's proven, or I'll say, I think a false sense of peace gives room to the flesh to wind up bringing more judgment and chaos, which would lead us to idolatry. Sometimes when you have these seasons where things are good and things are fine, ultimately what happens is you begin to forget again. When you're not under the fire, when you're not in the tests, when you're not having some nation, overcoming you and being really oppressive, you wind up forgetting exactly who God is, and then we see the cycle continue again. So look at verse 12. The Israelites again did what was evil in the Lord's sight. He gave King Eglon of Moab power over Israel because they had done what was evil in the Lord's sight. After Eglon convinced the Ammonites and the Amalekites to join forces with him, he attacked and defeated Israel, took possession of the city of palms, and the Israelites served King Eglon of Moab 18 years. Ew. Can you imagine? You get into this and you're like, oh, we did it again. Hopefully it's like a 2-year one this time. That's like one of your whole kid's life, adolescent life, in slavery. Mom and dad forgot, so they settled, worshiped idols, and cost little Johnny 18 years of his life in slavery to Eglon. Because when things are good and times of peace come, you just forget that you need to be dependent on the Lord and that you should keep your covenant with him. Well, he delivered me and things are great, so I guess it's fine. I'll just lax here. I'll sort of be a little bit lazy here. Don't really have to go here and do this. I didn't really read my Bible this day. Everything's okay though. And then you have people come to you really sadly and they're just like, I don't know why my young adult child is losing their minds. That's lulling yourself into judgment, and now that's 18 years of consequence that might not hit you immediately, but it certainly will hit the generation behind you. 18 years. Then the Israelites cried out to the Lord, and he raised up Ehud, son of Gera, and here's why this guy's not super impressive, a left-handed Benjamite, as a deliverer for them. Number one, in Judges 1:21, the Benjamites were one of the first ones to totally jack up their mandate, and they didn't drive out the nations that were in their spot of the land. So strike one. Strike two, he's left-handed, which might not seem like a big deal. In the culture back then, it was like you were lesser than because you were left-handed. Literally, it would mean sinister. Like you were viewed as like that person is either shifty or something's messed up in their life. Back in those cultures, they associated physical issues with sin and all kinds of weird stuff. And so if you were left-handed, you were out. So God goes, I'll give you a 91-year-old and a left-handed failure. It is certainly not about the judges. And the Israelites sent him with the tribute for the king Eglon of Moab. And Ehud made himself a double-edged sword, 18 inches long. Reminds you of the word of God. And he strapped it to his right thigh under his clothes, which was perfect because no one's going to check. Clearly nobody's left-handed. Left-handed people wouldn't be in the king's presence. And he brought the tribute to the king, Eglon of Moab, who was an extremely fat man. I read one thing that said some people think his waistline was 20 feet. I wasn't there. When Ehud had finished presenting the tribute, he dismissed the people who had carried it. At the carved images near Gilgal, he returned and he said, "King Eglon, I have a secret message for you." That's always enticing to any king. The king said, "Silence," and all his attendants left him. Then Ehud approached him while he was sitting alone in his upstairs room where it was cool. Ehud said, "I have a message from God for you." And the king stood up from his throne. Ehud reached with his left hand, took the sword from his right thigh, and plunged it into Eglon's belly. Even the handle went in after the blade, and Eglon's fat closed in over it, so that Ehud did not withdraw the sword from his belly, and the waist came out. Yep. This is why I said it can be a picture of the flesh. Because Eglon, in his description, is just like overconsumption, only about you, full, thinking you're in charge. And as soon as that double-edged sword, the word of God, comes through it, all the waste comes out the back and it's clean. When you allow the word to penetrate, that is where you can find cleansing in your life. And here, it happened quite literally. And Ehud, verse 23, escaped by way of the porch, closing and locking the doors of the upstairs room behind him. Ehud was gone when Eglon's servants came in. They looked and found the doors of the upstairs room locked and thought he was relieving himself in the cool room. That's what they called bathrooms, I guess. The servants waited until they became embarrassed and saw that he had still not opened the doors of the upstairs room. So they took the key, opened the doors, and there was their Lord lying dead on the floor! Exclamation point. I love that. Ehud escaped while the servants waited. He passed the Jordan near the carved images and reached Sarah. After he arrived, he sounded the ram's horn throughout the hill country of Ephraim. The Israelites came down with him from the hill country, and he became their leader. He told them, "Follow me, because the Lord," key, "has handed over your enemies, the Moabites, to you." That's probably the best shining character of a judge you're going to find. He's like, "Follow me because God just did this thing." So they followed him, captured the lords of the Jordan leading to Moab, and did not allow anyone to cross over. Finally, they did something right. Should have been doing that from chapter 1. At that time, they struck down about 10,000 Moabites, all stout and able-bodied men. Not one of them escaped. Moab became subject to Israel that day, and the land had peace for 80 years. After Ehud, Shamgar, son of Anath, became judge, and that is literally all you get. Nobody knows who this is. Everybody tries to make claims. They try to make weird connections. We don't know. It's actually really profound that you don't know, because the fact that he's obscure is perfect for the whole point that the judges are just people that God's plucking out of nowhere that seem totally unconventional. He's like, this is me teaching you how it works. I pick people that seem to be completely not ready to be used, not accepted by culture, left-handed, elderly, and some farmer from who knows where. He's like, and those people become the ones who will deliver you out of what's happening. And so he also delivered Israel, verse 31, striking down 600 Philistines with a cattle prod. You can't make this up. You try to go take on 600 people with a cattle prod, you're not going to win. But when God is trying to teach a future generation, the way that you fight your battles is you watch me win the victories. That's exactly how it works. And here's the issue, which is where we will land the proverbial plane. Israel had judges who could ultimately only reinforce a covenant that they had no ability to keep. Every time a judge delivered the people, it would be a reinstatement of what happened at Sinai. All right, we made it out again. Make sure you obey the Lord. Make sure you love him with all your heart, soul, mind, strength. Okay, we're going to get up. I will give the Lord my whole heart, my whole mind, my whole soul, my whole strength. And then they would get into a mess. They would be delivered from the mess. All right, guys, just so you know, make sure you keep your covenant, love the Lord. And it just is the same thing over and over and over and over and over. Not a single judge could offer them something that would be truly freedom from their cycle of disobedience. It would only buy them a few decades. The root of Israel's cycle of sin and our cycle of sin is disobedience to what God says. He tells them, worship me, nobody else. Drive out everything that's causing you to do the opposite. And they just wouldn't. And that is the root of sin. And so what God had to do is provide a deliverer. Because he saw us, and what the Old Testament law says is keep trying a little bit harder and maybe you'll get it this time. And God decided, I need to send a deliverer, a judge, who's actually going to offer something different that works. Romans 11:26. In this way, all Israel will be saved, as it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion. He will turn godlessness away from Jacob. And this will be my covenant with them when I take away their sins. He's talking about Jesus. Paul is quoting Isaiah 59 when he says that in Romans 11. And the word in Isaiah, the original quote for deliverer, is kinsman, redeemer. And that is who God determined we needed. You need someone like you, but perfect, who will stand in your place and officially take the punishment for the fact that you never fully will get out of this cycle until the other side of heaven. And so that's who he sent. Romans 5:18. As through one trespass there is condemnation for everyone, so also through one righteous act there's justification leading life to everyone. It was gonna take someone who could deliver them and keep them in a state of freedom based upon their perfection, because the people of Israel, and certainly you and I, can never live up to the standard of what was put out at Sinai. And God was not content to let that be the end of the story. Because he could have been, and he would have been justified. So he offers them a new covenant. Not only does he offer them his son as the deliverer, but that son brings a new covenant that is different from what was happening in Sinai. Jeremiah 31. Look, the days are coming. This is the Lord's declaration, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. This one will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors on the day I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, which is what was happening before the book of Judges. My covenant that they broke, which is the whole book of Judges, even though I am their master. The Lord's declaration. He says, instead, this is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after those days. The Lord's declaration. Now, we've seen all throughout Judges so far, Israel's declaration. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. I'm going to do this. I'm going to be faithful. I'm going to love you. And finally, God breaks through and he says, here's what I'm going to do. I've heard of all you want to do, and you're not doing great. So instead of condemning you, here's what my declaration is. I will put my teaching within them and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will one teach his neighbor or his brother, saying, know the Lord, which is the whole issue in Judges. Nobody's passing that on. And he says, for they're all going to know me, from the least to the greatest of them. This is the Lord's declaration. I will forgive their iniquity, and I will never again remember their sin. He ultimately says, you have been declaring to me how much you're going to be faithful and then doing the exact opposite. So let me move towards you now and tell you that if you accept this deliverer, my son, I'll forget all the rest. Because that's the last judge I need to provide. It says that Jesus is our advocate. Because that's the last deliverer I need to provide. Because when my law is written within you through the Holy Spirit, no one's going to have to teach anybody anything. You're just going to know me.